Welcome, everyone. We have so much to talk about today, Adam. Really great to see you on what's been a momentous week and a momentous day. We have to start with the Pam Bondi hearing this morning with the Epstein survivors sitting behind her. I didn't know that that was going to happen, actually. I thought it was very effective. But what a hearing. Okay, go.
Yeah, I mean it's the Democrats on the House committee were prepared for the theatrics that Pam Bondi accused
Yeah.
them of because they saw what happened in the Senate. And I'm just going to be blunt. It was a disgrace that it's going to take uh, explaining to future generations that this is not what oversight hearings are or ever have been,
Mm.
where you have insult comic at the stand on the witness table with a binder full of insults and opposition research. That instead of answering questions, and I've seen folks who are even trying to defend what Pam Bondi did, saying, oh, well, some of the people asking her questions were grandstanding. The chief law enforcement officer in the United States of America has a power to put you in prison. A Congress member is an elected representative of the people expected to engage in politics. You are not there to engage in politics. You are not there to engage in partisan messaging. And that was all that she was there to do. And
Mm.
you mentioned the salient point and thing that really goes to one of the stories that we've both been covering closely over the years. It's shocking that when asked about serious questions about the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, the files, the exposure of the private information of the victims, including their phone numbers, their personally identifying information, some of whom were never public before.
Yeah, their
Their
faces in
their
some cases.
yeah, they're in some cases nude photographs. That her response to that was more deflection, more insults, and at one point talking about the S&P and the Dow.
Oh, that
To
was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, it's not even in her remit.
Right. I think when she tried this stunt before the Senate, the the circus of it, the pugilism of it, that there were some people who thought, "Oh, well, it'll play well on cable." I don't think it did so this time. I think
No.
that just beyond the how terrible it is for our constitutional order, how terrible it is for the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell who are sitting behind her and who by their show of hands multiple times said, we want to speak to this Department of Justice which has betrayed our trust numerous times. She made no reference to that invitation.
Mm.
Time and again, first with Congresswoman Jayapal, then with Jamie Raskin, then with Congressman Dan Goldman. And so we see time and again giving her every opportunity to respond both like a human and two, like the occupant of the job that she has, which is Attorney General of the United States, that you have the opportunity to speak to people who are very relevant to your purported investigation, which you have tried to avoid conducting. And her response is to go into her flashcards and to go into
Yeah.
her binder full of opposition research. It's something that it doesn't really deserve to be called an oversight hearing at that point when you're cutting clips for political ads the entire time. That this is not the role of an attorney general of the United States, and it was just a disgrace.
No, and there was something very unseemly about the optics of a woman, a female attorney general, with those women sitting behind her there was something I felt that it was so aggressive. She may have had her back to them, but to not turn to insult the members of Congress asking the questions. And by the way, one of them, I think it was Ted Lieu, she sort of riposted, well, Merrick Garland, he was sitting on the same files. And Ted Lieu said, I know, yes, he was wrong. It was, we made mistakes too, the Democrats. And instead of any empathy and sympathy, which I would have thought any government official, it would be politically smart, forget whether it's real or not, to turn to these women and say, thank you for coming today. And, I'm sorry that this has been a botched rollout of these files. We're trying to do better. We'd like to do justice by you. It's all it would have taken.
Right. One question I did not see asked, I saw alluded to, I would have liked to have seen someone ask and to get this on record, although she would not have answered the question. She never answered any question, was the New York Times reporting about how nude photographs were released. Some of them appeared to be teenagers. It was unclear whether any of them were minors. I want to know whether the federal government released child sexual abuse material, and if so, if there's going to be accountability for that. Did they, in the release of the Epstein files, commit what would be a federal crime?
Yes, exactly.
Are you looking into that? Were the photographs that were released, the victim photographs that were released, did it include that horrible kind of disclosure? And if so, what is the federal government doing about it? But she was asked very clearly and multiple times to respond to the fact that nude photographs were released of survivors, that there were names of survivors that were released. There was phone numbers. This was asked of her repeatedly, and she just blew it off. And I think you're right that this was something that, on top of everything else, is just politically very stupid. I mean, if you're sitting there as a political operative and you're there with your, binder full of pot shots, that you would think that as a maneuver that would win your perceived side some points, that you might want to feign humanity.
That's exactly it. I mean, what I have always felt about Pam Bondi's role in the Epstein rollout is that, like Trump, she's just not that interested. And that's why she has misspoken from the get-go on this. Right. Do you remember when she said, I've got the Epstein files sitting on my desk? Well, I mean, it's not possible physically to see the Epstein files sitting on her desk. I mean, we now know the millions and millions of pages that comprise these files. I think, Adam, she didn't answer because I don't think she's got a handle on this. I think this has been a runaway train for her, as it has been in a way for Trump. I think he hates this story with a passion, chiefly actually not because I think he's done anything criminal at all, but because this is a narrative that he cannot control. And he likes to control the narrative. And Pam Bondi, I think, has delegated this out. Remember, this was the sort of baby of Dan Bongino and Kash Patel. Wasn't really her banging the drum. And I think she, in delegating it out, she's clearly lost control of it, which is not a great look for the Attorney General of the United States. I'm sure, something, Adam, she didn't answer the question, why are there nude photos in there? Why are there redacted? Why have names of, possible abusers been redacted? Because she doesn't know. I mean, I think one of the things that has emerged, and maybe the answer to your question is, I don't think the government itself fully understands what's in these files. I mean, I remember being amazed. You and I think we talked about it before Christmas. I mean, how does the Southern District suddenly stick its hand up and say, oh, we've got X million files that we didn't give to the Justice Department? How does that happen? It's mind-boggling. And then as we know, the deadline came and they only and they missed it, and they said, we're working so hard to redact these documents, and the whole thing was completely botched. They redacted the privileged and exposed the vulnerable.
Right. She went into office. One of the first acts that she did was sending out a memo describing Justice Department lawyers as attorneys for the president. So that's how she views the job, and that is how she acts. The day before this hearing, we have 6 lawmakers. A grand jury throws out a vile kind of case that would have essentially criminalized their accurate statement about the law that you have a right and an obligation to refuse illegal orders. Every grand juror said no. And so I think that is a very good bookend to today's hearing, because it's once again Trump's Department of Justice trying to go after here 6 members of the opposition party in a case that is hateful to the First Amendment and contrary to the law. And it goes up in flames. They can't convince a single grand juror. Forget about a no bill of an indictment. That's according to NBC News. Not a single grand juror signed on to it. And so everything, when I see her talking about the Epstein files, I see it through the prism of the way she has conducted everything in the office, that she has to, make the boss look good, protect the boss. And, she goes out of her way to say at one point, despite herself, she said that Donald Trump appeared in the files countless times. Indeed, he did. I think one of the biggest revelations of the millions of files that were released was so far as Trump goes, was this FBI document that was first flagged by Julie K. Brown in the Miami Herald, the one where Trump went to Police Chief Ryder from the Palm Beach Police Department and said that everyone knew what Jeffrey Epstein was up to, and you should look into Ghislaine Maxwell. She is evil, and that she was his operator. And so of course, everyone in Trump world is saying, oh, this shows how disgusted Trump was and that Trump was a whistleblower. And if you look at this document closely, it comes out in 2019 relating something that happened, a conversation from Ryder's perspective, the police chief, from 2006, after Jeffrey Epstein was arrested, after the case was published. And he says Ghislaine Maxwell was evil, and he says everyone knew. And everything we've seen after that, the I wish her well, the antics with Todd Blanche, and going down for the 2-day breezy conversation in Florida, after which Maxwell gets that transfer. And one of the remarkable lines, Pam Bondi tried to say that, no, it was the same kind of security prison. No, it wasn't. She was moved to a low security prison in Texas that she was not eligible for as a sex offender. That is an inaccurate statement under oath. And so in terms of Trump's role in this, I think she just keeps operating under this is a headache for the boss. I think you're right, Vicky, that she doesn't, Trump hates it, so she's not all that interested. Her marching orders are just to kind of make it go away. And if there's stuff that really makes it look bad for Trump, the fact that in in 2006, the police chief said Trump said everyone knew, which is really counter to everything Trump has said since
Right.
he became
Well,
president.
and here's the thing. He doesn't actually. The fact that he spoke to the police chief and said, lock him up and go get Ghislaine is a good thing. The problem is just like his commerce secretary, his story keeps changing. It would appear then he lied. I
Yeah,
mean, which is exactly what Howard Lutnick did, which is exactly what we're seeing again and again as more and more, we're getting to dig into these files more and more. We see all these men, for the most part, they are men, with the exception of Catherine Rumler, the general counsel of Goldman Sachs, who all said, "Oh, we did, we barely knew him." Well, not so fast, it turns out.
right,
Trump is leads that group. I mean, with that conversation with Chief Writer, who's sadly dead, so we can't go back. We can't go back to him. But I mean, I actually thought that Trump. I wondered even if Trump had given her some of her lines, her insults, had said, "Here's one you can use on so and so, and here's one you can use on so and so." Because in a way, what she also did is what he does.
right,
She's turned this story into a story about how fiery it was and the slinging match, and that, in a sense, detracts right from what it ought to have been. Questions that the people, and the American people, and those survivors especially, want answered. And I've been thinking about this a great deal because it's ironic. Populism is, I think, one of the things that put Trump in the White House twice. And part of the populist movement, I think, is tied into this belief that there is a two-tier system in this country and maybe around the world, and that there's one rule for the very powerful and the very rich, and a completely different rule, whether it's the rule of law or what else, for the rest of us. And that alarming suspicion is what the Epstein files seems to really confirm.
right.
And in this, in the globe, this 0.001% was complicit and transactional. They were all prepared to overlook Epstein's sex crimes. They didn't care about the victims. They were all getting something, often money, through dealing with Epstein, and Epstein was getting an edge of them. This extraordinary global network. And so here's the irony, is that I think that many of Trump's base will have had their worst fears about the quote unquote deep state confirmed by these files. And yet Trump, in a way, can't, it's now Pandora's box has been opened and he's lost control of it.
Right. It's the dog that caught the car. I mean, he
Yeah.
tried to. That's one of the reasons why the phrase "the Epstein class" has landed.
Yes.
You see Congress members using that, and it sticks. And Trump is at historic lows of popularity, and yes, it's connected to that. He very much cultivated the QAnon ethos of he's the one who's going to combat a deep state that is not only disconnected, but predatory and evil and abusive to children. Like, that was the meta narrative that he fed upon. And to see that the people who really believed that he was going to bring some sort of accountability and justice to that. Among them, at one time, was Virginia Giuffre.
Oh,
It has been very disenchanting to see that, oh, as a matter of fact, the Attorney General of the United States is going to sit at the witness table during a House Oversight hearing and cannot make eye contact with the victims of an actual
yeah.
sex trafficking operation. She won't make eye contact with the survivors. She will treat it as a joke. She will talk about the stock market. And that's why I think this kind of pugilistic circus that we saw today is playing very differently to the pugilistic circus that happened before the Senate, because before the Senate, it had, I think people were shocked at the natural order of things, that an oversight hearing not resembling an oversight hearing, that the witness isn't going to answer a question and the witness will not subject herself to oversight, which has been the historic practice of that operation. And I think
Mm.
that the second time around, and you heard Jamie Raskin say it at
Yeah.
one point, we saw what you did in the Senate, and they came prepared. And there's something sad about it that so many accurately came to the conclusion that it doesn't matter how well I craft a question. It doesn't matter how narrowly I focus my question to get a concrete answer. You have a literal binder and flashcards full of political jabs that you want to run through for your attack ads, and I'm not going to play along with it. And I think that's why, just even as how we discussed as a broader media
Mm.
ecosystem discuss the Senate hearing versus the House hearing has changed. I don't think that her performance played well anywhere. Uh,
No,
I don't think.
no. I mean, she warbled on about, her job being to keep people safe. Well, that's exactly why those women were sitting behind her, because they hadn't been kept safe. So, I mean, what she should have been there was to give answers as to how she was going to really get to grips with the contents of the Epstein files to make sure something like this never happens again, and to make sure she's going to hold other people to account. I mean, that is surely what the job of Attorney General is. And to me, there was something, it was something really galling, Adam. We know that Epstein couldn't have trafficked and abused minors without the help of Ghislaine Maxwell. And, as you know, I made a podcast series about this, and there's something so galling about the idea of a woman doing this to other women and girls. And in some ways, the visual for me of Pam Bondi sitting there, not wanting to address the women behind her, almost had echoes of that. It was really, really galling. And I have to say, in my mind, I couldn't help but actually compare it, believe it or not, with Marjorie Taylor Greene. I never thought I'd say, but there's Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's been more, until very recently, more Trump than Trump.
Right.
And but she, these Epstein survivors struck a chord with Marjorie Taylor Greene, clearly, and has ended. It's been a sort of career ender, possibly for her. But where is Pam Bondi's humanity?
Right.
I mean, I don't know. I've been trying to write my book this afternoon, so I haven't actually seen. Did any of the survivors? I mean, I know 2 or 3 of the ones who were there today. Have they said anything? I mean, they must have been truly disappointed by that hearing.
So I saw the photo of the day, I would say, was when one of the I believe, this happened a number of times, but a couple of lawmakers asked them to stand up and
Mm.
raise their hands if they had tried to get in touch with the Justice Department. And it's just the photo of the day. You see all of them raising their hands behind a very aloof looking Pam Bondi standing there. So I haven't seen whether they've been interviewed since the hearing.
Since then,
Hearing adjourned not that long ago.
yeah,
I cannot imagine they are anything but disappointed to horrified by the spectacle
yeah,
place there.
absolutely horrified. I
Right.
mean, I think, because one of the things that is missing from the files is something that actually Pam Bondi could totally address. And it's something that Annie Farmer talked about. Why, when her sister Maria went to the FBI in 1996 and lodged a complaint with the FBI, was it ignored? Why, in 2011, when the FBI went to Australia to interview Virginia Giuffre, again, why was what she said shelved? And I think that we're looking to these files. We want to understand people. I remember so well how terrified the farmers were of Jeffrey Epstein. I remember being terrified of him myself. And so it takes, people go to the FBI for a reason, for protection. And when the FBI, when the Justice Department lets us down, we want to know why, and we want to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that's something she could. It's not even political, because since going from 1996, we've had both parties in power, different presidents. This is not a political question. It's an urgent question about the safety of people in this country of all political stripes.
Right. She didn't even have to denigrate necessarily her own Justice Department.
Right.
She could have said, based on our independent review of this, here is what we've learned. She could have actually performed the function of what an oversight hearing actually is, but she dealt instead in grievance. And we had talked about the stock market answer. There was another answer where she was confronted about the plight of some of the survivors, and then she pivoted apropos of nothing to Trump's impeachment. So the implicit message in both of these things, one after the other, is in the pantheon of injustices in Pam Bondi's world, there's Trump was impeached twice for blackmailing Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and then again for trying to instigate a coup d'etat, that these were injustices that ranked higher in her mind. And the fact that in her mind, Trump did not get sufficient credit about the high performance of the stock market, to her ranked as more salient, more poignant injustices, more searing injustices than the sexual abuse of Jeffrey Epstein's victims and survivors. And there's no other way to read that. I mean, when asked a question about the women sitting directly behind her, she pivoted to that. She pivoted to Trump's impeachment and her belief that he didn't get enough credit for a good stock market performance. And is it any wonder why her performance today was absolutely disastrous? And I think that that even Trump's cratering support is made so much worse by the spectacle of what she did today.
I'll be very interested to see where the polls go actually after this, because whatever your politics are, women, I have to believe women watching that, it will have really rankled them.
Right.
Very hard to watch.
Just tactically, she could have even continued if she wants to be a political operative, if that is the mode that she finds the best way to progress. Well, find a way to criticize the investigations that preceded your tenure. She didn't even do that.
No.
She just echoed Trump's, this is a distraction from all the good things. Why aren't you talking about the good things or the bad immigrants or the, a whole list of stale talking points and rehearsed binder full of insults. And, another question I would have, who prepared that binder for you?
Right.
I mean, what taxpayer money was used so that you could float attack lines on anyone who asked you a serious question? And, and there was one point, I think it was Representative Johnson, who said the Jekyll and Hyde treatment. That the Jekyll and Hyde treatment, and she said, well, what's that? Said the Jekyll and Hyde treatment is, you give a good face to your Republican questioners, and then you attack the Democrats. And no one can deny that was happening, with the exception of Thomas Massey, who she gave the Jekyll and Hyde treatment to as well, because
Right.
he would also, on occasion, ask fair, difficult, sober questions. And, she accused the people questioning her multiple times of spectacle, theater, I won't get in the gutter with you. And she's the
Mm.
loudest voice in the room. So there's really not much to say about all of that. It's
No,
yeah,
but I have a question for you because you and I haven't talked for a while.
yeah.
Have you been looking through the files, and if so, what has stuck out to you, both about what's in there, but also what's not in there?
Right, that's a good question. I have been looking into them. I have been, as you know, Vicky, I've been very interested in the financial side of this story. And one of the things that I have been looking into were the systems that made this possible. And there were allegations, for example, that Jeffrey Epstein arranged sham marriages in
Mhm.
order to keep survivors, the victims, under his control. That is in the files. That is actually something that I'm working on. That's something that hasn't gotten a lot of attention.
No, it hasn't.
And
Can't
I
wait. Please do. Yeah, I wanna read what you say.
thank you. But one of the things that, as I sift through a lot of these, it's become very clear to me. I've been looking at some of the after effects of some of this reporting that, for example, there are now investigations in Lithuania,
Mm.
Latvia, and, people say, "Oh, there hasn't been accountability." Yes, in the United States, Prince
Oh,
Andrew.
around the world. In
Yeah.
my native country, there certainly has been accountability, and it's still rolling. I mean, for anyone who's tuned on who doesn't know, I mean, I think most people do by now. Peter Mandelson, who had been recently appointed the British ambassador to the United States, and he'd already left that office when some of his communications with Epstein was known, but now he's had to resign from the Labour Party, from all his jobs, because it emerged that the police are now investigating whether or not he gave. It looks like he gave market sensitive information when he was in government to Jeffrey Epstein, which would have
Mhm.
financially benefited Epstein. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, who is also being investigated by the police for, again, looking like he could have shared financials he should not have shared. And King Charles has said he will help the police. And all of this has caused, the Prime Minister in England, the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is now fighting for survival on the back of all of this. He's being questioned as to why he ever let Peter Mandelson be appointed as ambassador. And he's saying, obviously, Mandelson lied. There was no way for him to know. But that shows you just how big a ripple effect Epstein is having just in one country. In France, there's someone's had to step down. Slovakia, Poland, um, Norway. I mean, it goes on, and we are sadly lost. But I obviously, the Senate did push Lutnick yesterday on the reversal he had to make on his story about Jeffrey Epstein.
Well, right,
Um,
but Lutnick is, just today, Trump gave him his full support, and
yeah,
that's the thing here. I mean, Lutnick was shown to have stone cold lied to the American
yeah.
people about his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. These are things that are causing real change in other countries. And, there's been a big law partner, Brad Karp, losing his
Yeah.
job because of the Epstein files. So it's happening in the private sector, but in the government, Trump has made clear that it's not even a sin in his eyes to mislead the public
Well, of
about.
course not, because what Lutnick's done is a mini version of what Trump has done on this story.
Oh,
As
absolutely.
we discussed, saying, "Oh, I had no idea that Jeffrey Epstein was up to doing that. Was doing what he was doing. He was a creep. I wish Ghislaine well." And now, I mean, I did report. I was vindicated actually when Julie Brown reported that conversation from 2006 with Police Chief Reiter, because I had been reporting for some time. It was known that Trump had a conversation in the 2000s with law enforcement. And that is why Jeffrey Epstein actually believed that Trump might have been behind him getting arrested. Turns out probably he wasn't, but Epstein was paranoid that it was Trump who and remember they had fallen out in 2004 over this mansion.
Well, you remember the dog that didn't bark email?
Yes.
When Epstein and Maxwell were talking with each other, and then in the email, Epstein said that he described Trump as a dog that didn't bark, and then referring to the times that they've been in the house together, and that Maxwell replied, "I've been thinking about that." And now we know, well, actually, Trump did bark privately to Police Chief Wright,
Yeah.
number one. And number two, that Maxwell was lying to Todd Blanche last August when she said, I don't recall ever seeing Trump in the house with Epstein, because there's an email record of her saying, yeah, I thought about that when we were all together at the house, that this is it's very clear. This is why I'm deeply interested in the residual effects outside the country, because this is where accountability is happening. We've all seen horrible emails like the torture video referenced in an email message that one of the Congress members blew up that email, that there was a reference by a redacted figure about loving the torture video.
Yeah.
Little context about that. And, you see horrible messages screenshotted and floating around the internet. And I always hesitate to do that as a journalist, because the email is the start of an investigation, right? That you want to find out everything that surrounds it. And this is what the lawmakers are doing. They're finding out who sent that email, and they're pulling the thread. And that in my own inspection of the Epstein files, I want to kind of flesh out, how does this match up to what we already know from a rich public record of the court records? How do we make sense of this disturbing message in the context of the broader picture? And so but I'm deeply interested in the accountability in other countries, because other countries are showing how it's done, that how accountability is happening, that investigations are launched. You don't have the chief law enforcement official of the country blowing off any serious questions, showing zero interest in following up on any thread and attacking someone who raises a reasonable question. So I think that as the United States, sinks more into a personal protection racket surrounding one man, we have to adopt a more global perspective here, realize that there are investigations happening from the UK to Lithuania. That's not to say that we give up on, demand accountability here, but also realize that this is something that occurred globally, and something that was investigated globally. One of the names that came up on the list of co-conspirators, Jean-Luc Brunel, the French modeling scout who was prosecuted and died under very similar circumstances to Jeffrey Epstein in his cell. So we have to keep the bigger picture here, that about where accountability is located.
Well, I totally agree. And I am on that. I am at least, one branch of government is doing its job, and so I'm glad that Leslie Wexner, Epstein's first financial benefactor, is coming to testify to Congress, along with Epstein's longtime lawyer and accountant. And, you're interested in the money. I'm interested in the money, because it's bewildering to me what's emerged in the files about Leslie Wexner. You have a guy who was a self-made billionaire. To become a self-made billionaire, you tend to be pretty sharp, pretty ruthless. It's not easy to become a self-made billionaire. And yet he turns around and he hands over, this is according to an interview that he did with the FBI in the weeks before Epstein died. And he says, I handed over him almost complete control of all my money. And I didn't really notice that, in fact, he was scamming from me. It took 20 years, according to Leslie Wexner, when he's talking to the FBI, for his wife, Abigail, to notice that Jeffrey Epstein appeared to buy a lot of real estate properties for the Wexners and then buy them himself at a great discount. And this was all going on, according to Wexner, without his knowledge. Well, I would love to hear him explain how that happens. It just beggars belief. And the other thing I think it's really important to remember about Wexner is he owned a big retail empire, but part of that was Victoria's Secret, the modeling agency. And Epstein used that modeling agency as a vehicle to entice, as part of his sex crimes scheme, because he would say to these young girls, well, if you come to my house, you can audition and I can get you into, Victoria's Secret, which is every model's greatest, they all want to be part of that fashion show. And so how is it, is Les Wexner really going to say that he had no idea that any of this was going on? If not, why not? I think there are real questions to be answered.
And in the words of Donald Trump, everyone knew. His words to police chief Ryder. When he said that, you were talking about how did he get his money. I just happened to have the printout in front of me because I was looking at it for something else. After that interview, the FBI interview with police chief Ryder, where Trump is telling Ryder that she is evil and focus on her, referring to Ghislaine Maxwell. The very next paragraph of the conversation with Trump is this line: "No one could explain how Epstein made his money." Indeed. And that's what the Les Wexner story is all about, that this was his first billionaire client, although he had denied that. And apparently one of the things we've learned from the Epstein files is that he had to pay back some of the money that he embezzled from Les Wexner. That actually came to light because that was actually never known. So yes, I'm very...
Well, we knew there was a smaller amount, but it turns out to have been a much larger amount, according to these files, like $100 million.
Absolutely. That's why I am deeply interested in an investigation that has fallen under the radar, and that is Senator Ron Wyden's investigation.
Right.
One of the things, as I've been looking through these files, he's essentially created a list of really interesting keywords because he's doing a follow the money investigation, and he has sought information on a certain number of topics in letters. And it's illuminating to go through some of those kind of under the radar, the names of his shell companies, his Little St. Jeff's, Little St. James, that is Nautilus Inc. That is the corporate ownership of that island, and to follow that thread. I'm very interested to see where Senator Wyden's investigation lands, because that, as you said, Vicky, the investigation in the UK, a lot of it is financial. And we've seen in terms of Poland is opening investigation about possible ties to Russia. So this is all I don't think that anyone should take a particular data point. We now have millions of data points that have been released through the advocacy of the survivors and in coordination with elected officials to craft this law to throw out a bunch of more data points. And now it's in the hands of journalists and state investigators from countries around the world. And so I think that it's far too soon to write off the potential for accountability. It is happening. One has to kind of expand one's view beyond the United States and take into account how long it actually takes to pull some of these threads.
Yeah. But I do also think, you and I have talked about, and I made a podcast series, reporting on as much as I could, but questioning, what was Jeffrey Epstein's appeal to people like Bill Gates? Why did they even, cross the threshold, right? What was Elon Musk even contemplating? Going to the island, what was it about this man who was a convicted pedophile when both those men, first got to know him, why? And I think these files do show that it is that Epstein is a one-man intelligence operation. And because he does know, and it's very useful. Bill Gates, I did see, has responded to that awful email that he says he never received that was in the files, that Jeffrey Epstein wrote maybe as a draft. It keeps saying, you had an STD and I was giving you antibiotics to give your wife surreptitiously and on and on.
Wife
And Bill Gates
denied that.
Yeah, and Bill Gates denied it. But what he did say was he went, why did he go to meet Epstein? Because he knew Epstein knew a lot of rich people around the world, and Bill Gates was looking to scale up his global philanthropy. And so he thought Epstein could be useful. In the same way, why did the Clintons have anything to do with Jeffrey Epstein? Because he gave him money for the Clinton Global Initiative, which, by the way, went on to do incredible work that saved, millions of lives. But obviously, I think Bill and Hillary Clinton, it's going to be embarrassing for him and that's why they called him in, right? Just to embarrass him. It's a political theater. There's no evidence that Bill Clinton remotely touched, abused any woman in Epstein's circle. What he did was exercise poor judgment. When you get on Epstein's plane and you see this, group of very young looking women, you're a former president who left office right after the Monica Lewinsky scandal. It's not a great look.
Right.
And, so that's his, that's he's going to be embarrassed over that. But I think the Les Wexner interview, I hope, will be revealing. I really hope that the interview with Richard Kahn, Epstein's longtime accountant, and Darren Intike, his longtime lawyer, is also going to be revealing, because it seems, they have said again and again, and there's litigation against them. They'll probably be, I bet they'll hide under client attorney privilege and all sorts of things because there is litigation against them. They've always said, they didn't know. They were just carrying out Epstein's instruction. What it seems clear from the files, certain email I've read that Richard Kahn, Epstein says, I need you to get money because this girl wants a really expensive purse that I've promised her. So can you facilitate it? Of course, how could he not know? What did he think was going on? So I hope that's bumpy for them. And I hope we get some answers out of that. And I don't know why they haven't called Leon Black. Somebody that I know, Senator Wyden, has been looking into. I noticed today the Wall Street Journal, I think, had an interesting, they profiled the financial documents of his that are in the files. There's no emails from him. We know that Leon Black doesn't use email. So he's possibly lucky, but because we all want to know why he paid Jeffrey Epstein more than $160 $1 million. I mean, he says it was for tax advice. Okay, what was that tax advice really? Um, and but there were there were documents in there that sort of did lay out what the blacks' finances looked like.
Right. And
Now,
we
a few years ago, not now, but yeah,
And we now know that investigators were looking into Leon Black as, in terms of what the Epstein files have disclosed. I believe that that was, I don't know whether it amounted to any sort of full on investigation, but the fact, all the litigation against him, that was on prosecutors' radar.
yeah,
Um,
as
and
it should have been.
as it should have been. Yeah, that was going on in the courts. There were accusations against him, and you're right. The Wall Street Journal did have a profile of Leon Black there, and so yeah, the follow the money investigation will be a really important one. Uh, Finding out, what I was saying a little bit earlier about the sham marriages, the architecture, how did it happen? You noted the modeling agencies. Yes, that is the source of the connection between Jeffrey Epstein and Jean-Luc Brunel. What about when they needed to keep certain people in the country? There were accusations in some of these civil lawsuits of immigration fraud.
Yeah.
That should be something of interest to the Trump administration. Their lack
Yes, exactly.
is
Bingo.
telling.
Yeah.
It's very telling that they have total disinterest in immigration fraud when it happens in the context of the Jeffrey Epstein investigation. What is in terms of all the litigation involving banks, involving, anything involving intelligence, that there is a lot more here. And I would say that the Epstein files has revealed a number of data points. You had
Mhm.
mentioned Bill Gates. When asked about, because I want to be precise, I want to stick to the facts that I know. Whenever anyone asks me about the question of blackmail, I say, well, there's only one documented instance of it currently on record, and that's Bill Gates. That this is,
Yeah.
as a matter of public record, Jeffrey Epstein, according to Bill Gates's own statement, tried to leverage a extramarital affair that Bill
Yeah.
Gates had with a Russian woman to get what he wanted financially. So we know that it happened at least that one time. We have now the FBI's assessment during one snapshot. Again, this is why I always hesitate when people see one message. That's the FBI's assessment at the time. They did not believe there was a more mass blackmail. They also believed there weren't the use of surveillance cameras, which we know is just not true. We have seen the cameras. We have seen emails that show Jeffrey Epstein asking his assistant to set up cameras in his apartment. There's been great journalism in the New York Times by David Enrich and others on this subject. So I think that's where the rubber hits the road here with putting everything together. It's a shame that during a House Oversight hearing of a person who is tasked with actually investigating this stuff, in
Mm.
processing it, in providing answers to what happened in the past, and what is being done now, is so much more interested in rattling off flashcards of political talking points and digs and opposition research than actually providing answers and context to all this new information that's now in the public record, and that we need to turn to other sources, that we need to turn to investigative journalism, that we need to turn to the non-broken investigative
Mm.
apparatuses of other countries for some accountability, for some information beyond, well, this email says X, for people who
Yeah.
really pull something deeper to get a fuller picture, more context, and some results.
Yeah, and actually, so I will say, something actually positive, certainly, because I've obviously been doing a lot of interviews on TV and radio about my long, long, long history and reporting on Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. And one person who listened, who used to work for the SEC, phoned me up and said, I now want to tell you, I've never been able to sort of go on record before, but I want to tell you the truth about. She was involved in investigating Steve Hoffenberg, and who was this gangster-like figure that Jeffrey Epstein was involved with, and who ended up going to jail for the biggest Ponzi scheme in American history prior to Bernie Madoff. And, there was a reference somewhere in these files where Epstein, again, it's not clear, is maybe drafting an email to Les Wexner referring to quote unquote gang stuff. And I wondered aloud on the radio, I think, if gang stuff had anything to do with Hoffenberg. And so she did, she cleared up for me something that, I have wondered at for a long time. That have always been questions about when Hoffenberg went to jail. The company, Towers Financial, was put into bankruptcy, and suddenly all the money vanished. And there were always questions, well, was this Epstein's? Was this in fact the source of Epstein's wealth? And it's around this time that he meets Wexner. And she said, no, actually, because there was no money, because it was a Ponzi scheme.
Right.
And there was nothing. And it was her view that Epstein had been on the fringes of Hoffenberg's world, but he was, and he had, so he had flipped, and he had, there was grand jury, he testified to a grand jury, but he wasn't part of the actual Ponzi scheme. So it was interesting. It was interesting, at least. I mean, that's why you do what you do, right? Because you learn something, and then, it's a bit like being in law enforcement. You sort of, you want people to come in who know stuff. And a lot of people, it turns out, in the global elite knew a lot of stuff about Jeffrey Epstein. And I noticed somebody wrote a note, rightly saying, let's not forget the victims. And I completely agree. But the reason that Adam and I are focused on the money is because there is no evidence that until Jeffrey Epstein acquired hundreds of millions of dollars and was surrounded by all this world of other multimillionaires and billionaires all around the world, there is no evidence that he abused or trafficked a minor. And so that is one of the reasons that the money is so important, because without it, I don't think this would have happened. And I know, even reporting on him, he would drop names to intimidate me. He threatened. Les Wexner was one of them. Les Wexner was a massive advertiser back in the day for Vanity Fair magazine. And the Limited, his company, was a huge advertiser. And Epstein threatened me and said, do you want to be responsible for the biggest advertiser at Condé Nast, the publishing company of Vanity Fair, pulling its advertising? And, definitely name drop, the Clintons and other people. And even just as a reporter, as a seasoned reporter, it was intimidating. So I can see why. So the money and the power, I can see why these vulnerable young girls were utterly terrified. And so that's why I think it's so, so important to understand how it's all connected.
Absolutely. When Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on the federal indictment, there was a press conference. I had the opportunity to ask a question of then U.S. Attorney Jeffrey Berman. And my question was, U.S. Attorney Berman, is Jeffrey Epstein a billionaire? And his response was no comment. And to your point, this was, it it would not have been possible without his wealth. This was called by Police Chief Ryder a pyramid scheme of sexual abuse that operated on hundreds of dollars withdrawals, many, countless times. He would give victims money for massages that escalated to sexual abuse and then paid the victims to find other
Yeah.
victims. And so the money is essential part of the story. And that's
Yeah.
why it's a follow the money story. And that's why the work that you've done in terms of Hoffenberg, that research, I find some of that case fascinating. That yes, that was the biggest Ponzi scheme before Bernie Madoff, and Stephen Hoffenberg did accuse Jeffrey Epstein after the fact of being part of that. And sorting out the fact from the fiction on that, trying to navigate how did he accumulate what he accumulated and how
Mm.
much did he accumulate anyway. It doesn't surprise me that the accountabilities uh, that is happening in the UK are financial investigations at
Yeah.
this point, and I don't think that's the last one. Um,
No.
so that's a sleeper story here, and it's something
Yeah.
that will be.
And I think we've got a lot of questions coming in about Russia, his ties to Russia. So here's what I will say about that. I think what it shows that he did have tentacles into the Kremlin. He was definitely engaged with a guy called Vitaly Churkin, who was a Russian ambassador to the UN. And he was also reaching out to a senior diplomat once Trump was elected in 2016. He wanted to get to Lavrov, who is Putin's communications secretary, because he said, tell Lavrov, I could be helpful in helping him understand Trump. And he talks and talks again about, trying to set up a meeting with Putin. It's not clear if he does or he doesn't. And, I have reported one of the things Jeffrey Epstein used to say, and no one knew whether to believe it or not, was that he managed Putin's money. It does seem clear that, look, the Russians at a high level are part of his global network. But what I think it shows, what the communications that I've seen so far show, is that what Epstein was doing wasn't working for the Russians. He was working for himself. He was trying to insert himself into the American-Russian dialogue around the Trump election, and then, as we know, one that's still continuing. And we've now seen, given his connections around the world, how successful he was in inserting himself into very high-level international discussions, communications, transactions. I mean, one of the communications he has with Peter Mandelson is when Peter Mandelson was head commissioner of the EU. That reason Andrew is being looked at is because Andrew may have passed on sensitive information when Andrew was ambassador for British trade. So you see how clever he is at using his network. Yes, it is a form of espionage, but it's not clear to me that he's working for anybody else's government. He's working for himself.
Right.
And he'll pass tidbits on to whichever country, he'll do whatever transaction works chiefly for him.
Yeah, and money begets money, power begets power. And we see, now because of the Epstein files, you can see the original indictment, what they were going to accuse him of and charge him with, and what it became. And we talk about, how did he get back into power and influence? Well, the thing that we now see that would have been his indictment never saw the light of day. And the thing that he was actually charged with gravely minimized what he was doing. And
Yep.
then the first person decided, well, this makes me uncomfortable, or it doesn't make them uncomfortable. and it's worth maintaining whatever relationship. Maybe it's a powerful banker like Jess Staley, or maybe it's an academic. And there was a reputational laundering from this plea deal. And once he got back into the company of the wealthy and powerful, wealth and power reaccumulated. So it becomes more comprehensible. It doesn't require a grand conspiracy to explain. It's the original sin. The original sin was his reputation was laundered, his crimes were minimized, and
Yeah.
he got close to power again, and power welcomed him back.
Well, and he was also, I mean, the other thing that is, I think, has been very interesting to read is how clever he was when he chose his quote unquote dream team of lawyers who negotiated that plea deal for him. Because you do see these emails between Jay Lefkowitz, who was one of the lawyers representing Epstein, and Alex Acosta, who was then the US attorney in Miami, who agreed to that cushy plea deal, which meant that the federal, all the work that the feds had done just went out the window. And but you see their pal emails, because of course, right when Alex Acosta left office after that, he went to work at the same firm as Jay Lefkowitz. So you see it's all one big boys club, but you also see there was another piece of correspondence that I was interested, where the names of these government or Justice Department officials are redacted. And I'm very annoyed that they're redacted, because I really like to know who they are. And in 2011, there are emails going back and forth because Brad Edwards, this Florida lawyer who is now representing a lot of the Florida victims, and Virginia Giuffre, who are pushing back and saying that the plea deal was a breach of the Crime Victims' Rights Act because it was done without telling the victims. It was done completely behind their back. And this correspondence between whoever these officials are is saying, well, we've got to dig in. What we did was legal. We got to protect the legality of it, regardless of whether we think what was in the deal was right or wrong. Right there. I mean, I read it and I was like, right there, they knew that this was absurd and just ridiculous, that plea deal, and it shouldn't have been done. But they were going to dig in and protect the legality of doing it and not telling the victims. So, I mean, we're going to be here for years trying to go through these files and make sense of everything, because it's very, it's not easy to search them, right? Because I don't know if you find this, the way they have it, you see page 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you'll click on a document on page 4 and then it logs you out of the system, and then you have to go all the way back. I mean, it's not user friendly in my experience. I don't know what you found.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah, not user friendly at all. It's a search, and so the odd "Are you 18?" at the top of the page, which I don't know what the Justice Department does to check that people are clicking appropriate boxes, and whether that's actually the purpose of filtering users to accessing it. But I'm sure it'll give us plenty of stuff to talk about and plenty of things for investigators around the world to sift through as time goes on.
Yeah. Adam, we've got to continue this conversation. Is there anything else you want to chat about today?
I think that we covered a tremendous amount of ground. I want to give a shout out to the 2.7 thousand people who are
2.8.
2.8 2,800 people on this chat now, who have many of whom have stayed on for an hour and 10 minutes now. Thank you very much. If you are on the late side of this, if you could subscribe to Vicky Ward Investigates and All Rise News, I will have an archived version of the chat on All Rise News, and I imagine you're doing the same, Vicky.
I will be doing the same. I just see one question at the end about Bannon, and the videos Bannon was making with Steve Bannon was making with Epstein. And I will just say this: so I know Steve Bannon. I wrote a book about the first Trump administration, and when I heard through a source that Bannon was meeting Jeffrey Epstein, I said to Bannon, that is a terrible idea. And I suspect he should have taken my advice. But look, I mean, he hasn't addressed this. I don't believe he hasn't addressed this topic. Curiously, it's probably better for him that those videos are at least coming out in these files than if he'd actually tried to put together a documentary rehabilitating Jeffrey Epstein, because that would not have been possible. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Vicky.